So, picking back up on our section on social dilemmas and collective action, a few updates and reminders. Your outlines 11 and 12 are now graded as well as quiz 6. Your activity 6 is currently in the process of being graded. Hopefully, I'll be able to finish that up by the beginning of next week. And your activity 7 is due Sunday at 11:59 p.m. just to give you a little extra time as we head into the last few weeks of the semester. Also, please make sure to watch the supplementary videos. And the reading for next week is now available on Canvas. And that's just to give you a little bit of extra time to get a head start on that if you'd like. And one thing I want to mention about the reading, and I'll mention it a few more times in the next couple of lectures, but it's um it's a really interesting read. They cover a few different things. And so while I always encourage you to read all of an article. It's not necessarily, um, you can kind of skim through the methods section. This isn't a methods class. So, unless you're really interested in that, I think it would be helpful if you just focused on the other sections of the paper and not necessarily had to go through the methods part in detail. But yeah, so that is now available. Hopefully that gives you a little extra time, and if you have any questions, please let me know. So, picking back up from the last lecture, one of the things we focused in on was the problem of order and how the questions that are fundamental in research and discussions on social dilemmas and collective action, as well as, again, social dilemmas and collective action problems are synonymous. So, in this research and area of discussion, and how a lot of the questions that are asked there are fundamental to not only sociology, but social psychology. And at its core, we're all trying to answer questions essentially about social order. And so we talked about the problem of order. And this is really at the heart of this particular section. And that's something we're going to do an overview, but also get into a little bit of the detail in terms of what we mean by social order and how is it addressed through this particular theoretical lens. So we know from research um, is that high levels of cooperation can't be sustained merely on the basis of the preferences and generalized trust that people carry around with them. Rather, the micro level manifestations of social order, so things like cooperation, trust, and pro social behavior among individuals, it requires um, also the operation of mechanisms embedded in social settings. So they're more than just these direct products of individuals' altruism. So, meaning that instead of focusing on these micro level processes, that's not necessarily uh, it's not necessarily sufficient when we're addressing these macro level issues. And so there are three broad classes of social mechanisms that promote cooperation and pro social behavior. And these are the things that we're going to discuss today. And so the three broad classes of social mechanisms that promote cooperation and pro social behavior are rules, reputations, and relations. And these mechanisms are critical for understanding the foundations of social order because individual level factors are, like I said, not sufficient for large scale collective efforts. And these mechanisms work in two ways. The first way being that they operate primarily by bringing the behaviors of more self interested individuals in line with group goals. So, we talked a little bit Monday about how some of the things that promote pro social behavior, and one of them was conformity. So those social pressures, norms, um, pressuring people to conform. And so because of that, it brings the behaviors, not the motivations. Again, we're specifically focused on behavior. That's something that's observable that we can define and observe. And so it's bringing the behaviors of more self interested people in line with the goals of the group. So that conformity kind of brings everyone together on the same page. Unites them with the same page, the same plan, and the same process moving forward. And second, because it is often unclear whether these actions are produced by underlying motivations of individuals who cooperate or behave pro socially. So, again, the mechanism works by one, bringing people in terms of their behavior to conform to these group norms and expectations so that everyone's kind of on the same page, so that the people who are super self interested are kind of brought, that's mitigated, and the people who are maybe not self interested enough, it also brings them kind of to this middle ground. Um, and as the second point makes about how these mechanisms work, the second way is, like I said, because it's often unclear whether these actions are produced by underlying motivations. Um, it's it's part of that, how this particular mechanism how these mechanisms work. So, like I said, the mechanisms that we discussed in the previous slide, these micro level manifestations of social order, so cooperation, trust, and pro-social behavior. So we're focused on these things and they come from the micro level, but perhaps they can tell us something about what's going on the macro level. And so again, they're operating in these two ways is one, brings people to conform, and two, makes it a bit more ambiguous as to whether or not it's due to underlying motivations or or not. It makes it a little more ambiguous, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And so, like we said, that there's this altruistic behavior and there's altruistic motivation. Altruistic motivation is something that's difficult to define and even more difficult to observe. So, we can observe what we might call altruistic behavior, which is behaving seemingly in a selfless way, in a way that just benefits others and isn't necessarily self interested. Maybe that's sacrificing something. Maybe you're going to incur some sort of cost or punishment, or maybe, very little. But either way, it doesn't really do something to reward you necessarily. It's purely for the sake of others. But like I said, we can really only observe behavior and define the things that we're specifically looking to observe in behavior. Motivation is much more difficult. And so when we talk about this, it's not necessarily a focus on motivation. It's more so um, understanding that it does obscure our perceptions and understandings of others' motivations. So, getting into rules specifically. So, again, um, these three broad classes of social mechanisms that promote cooperation and pro social behavior. The first being rules. So, from a sociological perspective, norms and the sanctioning of counternormative behavior is central to moral order and social solidarity. And broadly speaking, norms could be categorized in two ways. The first are descriptive norms, so regularities of behavior, what most people do in a given situation, whereas injunctive norms are behavioral expectations that are backed by social or material sanctions. So, again, descriptive norms are those regularities, those things that are more commonplace, kind of implied. It's what people tend to do in these situations, whereas injunctive norms are behavioral expectations that are kind of founded in these social or material sanctions. So, if you there's a difference between what is common and what will kind of like get you in trouble or ostracized or praise, even whatever the case may be. Praise isn't necessarily a sanction, but um, more so things that I think in terms of like punishment, something that would discourage you. So there are certain things in place that are meant to discourage you in those norms. So think about like, I don't know, stealing from someone. So certain injunctive norms, there are repercussions, there are, social or material sanctions for stealing. And that's supposed to, it's not necessarily saying that, maybe a lot of people do that, hopefully not, but there are these certain, like, more formalized sanctions in place, and so those would be injunctive norms. And so research shows that descriptive norms can have large effects on pro-social behavior, One field experiment found that providing households with information about typical levels of electricity usage for their neighborhood led households to assimilate to the perceived norm in the weeks that followed. So, and this has been done in a few different places, and I always find this example so interesting is that simply by showing people what others in their area are doing, here's their norms, right? Like you can see the outliers, the people who are using a ton of like water and electricity and all of that. You can see that for the most part, people are using electricity and water, whatever the case may be, within this particular range. And because of that, because of the social pressure that is put on us, this descriptive norm, this something that is considered commonplace, we tend to conform to that, to assimilate to those normative standards of usage. So, thinking again, that's something that's relative. You're looking to others and kind of basing what is expected of you on others. So, you know, kind of what's within the realm of kind of the average of what most people are doing, what's more commonplace, and you know the things that are going to make you be more of an outlier. So, it kind of sets those boundaries and parameters in terms of like expectations of behavior and performance. And so, how it affects pro-social behavior, which again, as we discussed Monday, it's there's not necessarily a shared outcome. Although, of course, you could look at this and say, in terms of like the environmental costs and all that stuff, you could look at it and say, well, if a whole neighborhood is using less electricity and water, like there is this shared outcome for us all. And that's, that may be true, but really we're kind of looking at the immediate situation. So when we're talking about this, we're not thinking like long term necessarily. We're thinking kind of the immediate observable situation. And so there's not really a shared outcome. It's more so like I will behave pro socially because really I'm just conforming to these particular um, these normative standards, these descriptive norms. And so, um, it's you're behaving in a pro-social way, in a way that benefits one or more others, but there's not necessarily this immediate and more explicit and observable shared outcome. Another example is from another field experiment, found that when a descriptive norm violated a corresponding injunctive norm, such as when graffiti or the sounds of fireworks were prevalent in a public space, passersby were more likely to violate other social rules, such as prohibitions against littering and theft. Thus, the mere perception of what is typical is sufficient to shape whether individuals engage in pro social or what we call antisocial behavior. And so, for those of you in psychology, antisocial has a few different meanings within that particular discipline. But here, when we talk about pro social versus antisocial, it's kind of like thinking in terms of norms, normative behaviors, and expectations. And so, I really enjoy this example because I think about maybe on holidays like the 4th of July or New Year's or Halloween, where things are a little bit different. Like typically, you're not just allowed to walk in the street um, or light fireworks in the street or whatever the case may be. But on these particular holidays, um, these descriptive norms that violate these corresponding injunctive norms. So, like, what people just do, like, you go outside and you light fireworks on the 4th of July, and you're not supposed to do that, right? That's against the law in a lot of places, particularly when you're within city limits, but people do it anyway. And so, because of that, because of these kind of relaxed expectations or these descriptive norms that violate the injunctive norms, it's kind of like, well, we're all doing it, and so you relax your those normative expectations in terms of like other things like here it talks about littering and theft, but I think in this case, the fireworks in the street, I more so think about like you know or even something like game day. Goes for fireworks and streaks on the 4th of July, on New Year's, but also something like game day, where typically you're not allowed to walk in the street and do all this stuff, but people do it anyway. And then people also walk around, drinking like with an open container. And, that may or may not be legal within that context, but I don't really think anyone's looking that up because they just look around and everyone's doing it. We've kind of relaxed these standards. We're not going to be as strict in terms of like what's legal, because the norms of this particular event are different than kind of what we're used to on an everyday basis. So then that kind of broadly applies to many other things. The second broad, um, the second broad class of these social mechanisms that promote cooperation and pro-social behavior are, so uh, we've talked about rules, and now we're going to talk about reputations. So the reputational rewards that go to those who behave in generous or cooperative ways are now also viewed as a powerful force shaping pro-social action. Reputation is the set of judgments a community makes about the personal qualities of one of its members. And so, what's important to know about reputations is these reputational rewards is that you want to be seen as, being generous or cooperative, someone who works well with others, and who people generally like. Your reputation is something that's very valuable. And so, you're behaving in pro social ways so that you can get these reputational rewards, or sanctions in some cases. So, not just the pressure to conform to these norms being, very powerful, but also the pressure of, what it could do to your reputation for better or for worse, um, also influences people to behave in more cooperative and pro-social ways. So again, we talked about social exchange as a room for altruism, and the answer to that is maybe. Here, again, the answer is maybe, but we're specifically looking at why people behave in cooperative ways. We're addressing the issue of social order. How does society remain ordered in some way? How is it that millions of us manage to cooperate and collaborate, in a variety of ways and come together? And so the first one is those rules, those norms. The second is reputation. And so these things are functioning more on the micro level, but it's more so a manifestation of things. Like, how does that if it's operating that way on the micro level, how might that create these different processes and outcomes on, the meso or the macro level in particular? And so that's what we're saying here. Also, for this particular slide, when I typed in reputation to find some sort of picture that could represent that, I was met with nothing but pictures of Taylor Swift's Reputation album, and I was very tempted to incorporate that into this slide, but the picture didn't quite fit with, um, the particular shape of, uh, the picture, the image for this slide. But yeah, I typed in reputation, and that's truly the only thing that came up, like, no other pictures. But yeah, so your reputation is something that's very important to protect and to preserve. And so that's something that, is a very powerful force for promoting pro-social behavior and cooperation among individuals and groups as well, because keep in mind that we can look at groups as kind of like their own entity. Like a group wants to be seen, we could think of like an organization, like they want to be seen as someone who works well with others, who, is a good collaborative partner. And so that applies to not only individuals, but groups as well. And then finally, the third are relations. So people can only have reputations if they are connected to others. Um, so either directly or indirectly through social networks. So again, keep in mind we talked about relations and how, the nature of those relations is important. And Monday we talked about that in terms of social exchange. But here we're particularly looking at how people are connected to each other within these broader networks and how that is also connected to these reputational rewards. Is that in order to have this reputation, you have to be connected to others, whether that's directly or indirectly through these broad social networks. Think about it like I'm sure there's been times in each of your lives where, especially if you're from a small town or a very close knit community of some sort, is that everybody tends to know everything about everyone, and so something that you do, something small that you do will certainly make its way around, like, everyone will somehow end up knowing about it. Um, and so that's you might not it might not even come from people who you know directly, but people who kind of know of you loosely, and how this kind of spreads through these broad networks of people who are connected in more indirect ways. Also, that social relations are frequently characterized by emotional commitment, feelings of moral obligation, interest in the partner's welfare, and reduced uncertainty about the other's likely behavior, all of which can promote prosociality. So, because we're connected to others, we tend to have a sense of commitment to the people we're connected to, whether that's people we're connected to in terms of our family or close friends, or just people we interact with on a regular basis. And so, like, as an instructor, like, of course, it's part of my job description, to have a sort of like commitment to you all, right? But I also am interacting with you on a regular basis. So there's this sort of emotional commitment of like, not just, okay, I have to provide, the instruction and the work and do the grading, kind of everything that's, important there, but also like taking some sort of um, interest and investment in you all. Like if one of my students is, needing help with something or wants to discuss something that it's beyond my job description in some way, um, it's because I feel that like sense of commitment to you all beyond just like those very like basic, job description of like, hey, I'm just here to teach and that's it. And you can only talk to me during, 1 hour a week. Um, but because I feel that sense of commitment and, like, moral obligation and interest in your welfare, um, that it promotes that pro-social behavior because I care. And you can think of that too, like, maybe you feel that way about other classmates or your instructors or people at your work or people, you work or serve in some capacity. And so those are more indirect relationships. I mean, they are direct, but they're not necessarily people you're particularly close to or relationships that will necessarily be enduring over time. And so we typically think about this in terms of people we're very close to, but the point being is that we're a part of these broad social networks, and that connects us to others, and so that provides us with reputational rewards or sanctions. But it also makes us feel a sense of commitment and obligation to others, a care for their welfare. So because of that, we tend to want to behave in more pro-social ways because we care. We have this sense of commitment to this, kind of vast network of people, and that sense of commitment can be brought about for a variety of reasons under a variety of conditions. But because of that, because of these things, that also more deeply connects us to others and makes us want to behave in ways that benefit them and that benefit others. And the expectation that some relations are expected to endure in the future influences present interactions, reducing incentives for self interested or exploitative behavior. So, just the expectation that this is going to carry on into the future. Um, and one example I can think of is like, I don't know, maybe you're at work or mostly I think of this in terms of like a job, but again, I'm sure many of you have been in situations, not just within a work environment, but we'll use that as an example, is where you're really upset about something and you want to address something, but you're like, well, I'm going to be working with this person for a while, so I might as well figure out how to deal with it in a way that isn't going to, burn any bridges or cause any, um, difficulty or strain within that relationship beyond what already exists, right? Because you know that that's going to be something that this is going to be, a more enduring relationship, at least for the time being. And so I want to, it's reducing my incentives to behave in a self-interested way. And hopefully it's doing the same for them. Um, they might be doing something you don't really like, and you're like, well, hopefully, because they know this is going to be a more long-term relationship, um, that it will reduce their incentives to behave in these self-interested and exploitative ways, or at least that's what it's supposed to do. So they're looking at these variety of mechanisms that are related to these three broad categories of, rules, reputations, and relations, and how all of these things work together. Of course, not 100% of the time. They can't explain every single interaction or, every single dimension of social order, but they are used to explain, like, here are some of the reasons why there is social order. And so, one particular example, um, and so, although the highest levels of prosociality tend to occur within enduring positive relations, research also shows that there's these important distal network effects in which prosociality is often extended to those to whom one is only indirectly connected, meaning that these same feelings of commitment and care for their welfare can extend to not just the people you're directly related to, but the people who are related to them, the people who know them in some way. And so, for example, during the Holocaust, many Jewish people were aided by people they already knew. But also, many people were also helped by friends of friends who were to them complete strangers. And so, this example right here, I just wanted to highlight it. It's a story of a woman named Clara Beich. She was a Serbian single mother, and she sheltered um, these two little boys who were Jewish. And at the time, the people were trying to find a home for these boys to hide them during the war. They, went from kind of person to person and some friends and some family friends, and the family friends were like, "They can stay here, but only for a little while, and we don't really feel comfortable." They went to somebody else and they were like, "Yeah, we'll accept them for a price because, there's a huge food shortage right now and I can barely support my family." And so then the family went to this priest they knew, who was a friend, and he turned to one of his friends, which was Clara. And, even though she had very little, he was like, "I know this is, something she really cares about," um, and, worked out the situation, and she happily took in the 2 boys, and sheltered them and protected them and, made sure they were fed and taken care of during this time. And even to many, many, many years later, they maintain a relationship. Um, and, they were able to be reunited with some of their family after the war. And it was all because of, the selfless acts of this woman. And she didn't even know the family. She didn't know the boys. She was just connected to them indirectly through some of the people she was friends with. And so, um, yes, this is something she deeply cared about, but also, like, being able to find those connections and the people who are willing to help and willing to help in a way that isn't exploitative or self-interested. We could say perhaps part of that is because of the care and commitment and obligation to others that extends through these, vast networks of human connection. And so, in terms of this particular example, more generally, studies of naturally occurring networks also find that generosity decreases as network distance between individuals increases, such that people are generous toward friends of friends, somewhat less so towards friends of friends of friends, and least generous towards more distal others or strangers. So if you mapped out your network of, like, let's say, this, like, inner circle of people you're directly connected to, and then outside of that's a bigger circle of people um they're connected to, and you kind of know maybe as acquaintance or like through a friend of a friend type situation. And then outside of that there's this, super vast network. And so you can kind of, you know to some extent say the highest levels of this generosity are within your inner circle, and then they decrease just slightly in that, slightly bigger circle. And then outside of that, it's really there's a lot of variance in terms of the level of generosity people are willing to extend. And so that decreases the farther within that network people get. from you directly. Networks can also indirectly encourage prosociality through the spread of reputational information, like we said, about others' trustworthiness. So, how trustworthy someone is in terms of the likelihood that they are going to exploit somebody based on exploit somebody's trust, or are they going to honor? Are they going to exploit their trust? So these networks can indirectly encourage prosociality through the spread of reputational information about others' trustworthiness through ties that connect group members and by shaping levels of trust in strangers. So the development of interpersonal trust in cooperative relationships tends to generalize, promoting greater trust in strangers. So if you're experiencing, high levels of interpersonal trust in cooperation within your closer relationships, you're going to tend to generalize that to others. So if you aren't experiencing these high levels of trust and cooperation, you're going to tend to also apply that to others, that you're going to expect that most people aren't trustworthy or cooperative, and vice versa. And individuals tend to pay generosity forward, responding to acts of kindness by subsequently behaving more generously with third parties. So, thinking about consider how you react in different situations. So, if somebody maybe, like the car example of someone trying to get out of the driveway into traffic, if someone stops and lets you go through and for no reason at all, and you're just so appreciative that they let you out, and you're able to, be on your way to your journey. Or if you're ever in line somewhere, like to get coffee or food or whatever, and the person ahead of you pays for your drink, I think is a good example. Someone pays for your coffee, which is so nice. And sometimes it really can make your day. It just makes you feel good. Maybe you didn't really need someone to pay for it, but you're still so appreciative. It was such a kind thing to do. So maybe you go ahead and you're like, hey, I want to pay for the person's coffee behind me. I want to make their day as well. And it continues, people kind of like to pay it forward because they're so, it's such a good thing. It's promoting this pro-social behavior, when others behave generously towards you. And then at some point, it gets to, the person in line who really, really needed a coffee, like desperately, like maybe they're studying for finals, or they had to work really late and they had to get up and go back to work, and we don't know the situation, but they desperately needed a coffee even though they knew that they're spending their last few dollars to get it. um and then, this is passed all the way through this line of people, and it gets to this person, and they find out that someone paid for their coffee, and it's like, maybe they can't pay it forward, like, in a monetary sense, like they can't pay for the person behind them, like, they can't pay for their coffee, but later that day, they might go on and do something kind, for someone else, like letting a car out so that they can be on their way, or opening the door for someone, or, whatever the case may be, and it kind of makes it way to the people who genuinely, could benefit and truly, um, might need that particular reward. That so they're saying that this is kind of how pro-social behavior expands throughout these broad networks of people who know each other, but also people who don't, and how that can keep social order in some way. It can keep us together and cooperative, through these variety of mechanisms. And so, like it says here, that pro-social behavior diffuses through social network ties, linking micro level understandings of factors that promote prosociality with features of network structure. So, in this way, it's connecting those micro level interactions to more meso and macro level processes. It's saying that this isn't just something that exists between two people or a few people. This is something that spreads throughout vast, vast networks of people, and everyone's doing it in their own capacity in different ways every single day. And that because of this, it keeps society functioning and ordered in some, coherent pattern. But other than that, so Monday we'll pick back up on. We're going to go into different types of social dilemmas, or collective action problems. We're going to go into specific examples, kind of some work that's been done in that area. And I think it'll be a really fun discussion as we kind of wrap up our time together this semester. But other than that, that's it for today. I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks.